Thanks so much. We just finished really what I would consider to be an incredibly productive day. It's a very enthusiastic group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous leaders from across the province partaking in the Premier's Indigenous Roundtable. Discussed some tough topics, some progress that has been made, but most importantly, the path forward with respect to reconciliation. There's a common understanding that there's an incredible way to go, but equally that we've begun the first steps on that path. So it was a great meeting. It was one that has been building on the weekly meetings that we have with our Indigenous leadership. And I need to thank Chief Mitchell for hosting us. He's been incredibly gracious with his time and efforts. And it's been just an honor and a privilege to be here in Corner Brook, so trying our best to navigate this path forward. So thank you, Chief Mitchell.
Thank you for being here.
Do we want to do questions now, or Minister, do you have a couple of comments?
Just to say it's been, for me, it's my third Premier's Indigenous Leaders Roundtable, and but it's the first time that I've seen a Premier bring 4 ministers. So I think that speaks volumes to where Indigenous issues and reconciliation sits on the list of priorities for this government. We've had some very meaningful discussions today, and every time we come and we sit around a table with Indigenous leaders from across the province, there's always new learnings. We always are sent away with homework to do, and we will continue. You know, we meet weekly. We have calls weekly with Indigenous leaders, the Premier and myself, and we'll continue to do that and to sit down with other in groups, because it's very important that we never pretend or get to a place that we think we understand what all of the issues are that those people are dealing with at various levels, and so improvements can only be made by open communications. Thank you.
Chief Mitchell, would you like to have a few words?
Yes, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Well, good afternoon, everyone. We had a very busy day and a beautiful evening last night. We had a reception here. I'm just so honored to have the Premier here today. As Minister Dempster said, 4 cabinet ministers. We are blessed here in Newfoundland to have a Premier and cabinet who are so involved, entrenched, so respectful of truth and reconciliation. It's been demonstrated clearly today in all the calls we have every week with the Indigenous leaders and many others who take part in those calls. There is a strong commitment by this province to work with Indigenous people, Indigenous communities, in an attempt for all of us together to build a better tomorrow for Indigenous people in this province. And yes, truthfully, not just Indigenous people, all Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. So this roundtable was our third. Maybe the next time we would be in Happy Valley Goose Bay. We had planned to have one there last year. Unfortunately, COVID-19 changed our plans. But we're so pleased to have this event happening in Corner Brook, and again have the Premier and all these other officials and Indigenous leaders here. It's been a great evening last night again, and today. A lot of nice stuff talked about. We know that we need to be collaborating. We have some direction as to what issues are important to Indigenous, not just communities, but Indigenous organizations in Newfoundland and Labrador. And now you know we have the very listening ear of our Premier and Minister Dempster and cabinet members. So we had a great day, productive. Thank you all. And again, to Premier Furey, thank you so much for everything you do on behalf of all of our people in Newfoundland and Labrador. Wulawan.
Sure. Yep.
Mike, you mentioned there that there were tough topics brought up in the spirit of reconciliation. Back in June, yourself and Mr. Dempster said you were going to be looking for Indigenous lead on how to move forward on possibly investigating the formal residential schools in Newfoundland and Labrador. So was there any discussion of that today, and what was it?
It wasn't specific to today, other than a very in generalities. We have spoken about it on our weekly calls, and the department has reached out to each Indigenous group and each Indigenous leader, and we've actually assigned departmental staff to help facilitate and navigate that ongoing discussion. As I've said many times, and I'll repeat, we are here to fully support the Indigenous groups in their investigation, discovery, and recovery and rehabilitation from that. As you can imagine, the psychological impacts of that are going to be long extending as well. So we are here to support with if finances are required, if infrastructure is required, and if there is subsequent psychological support that is required.
But I didn't particularly come up.
We addressed in generalities the residential schools and had a moment of silence and the importance of residential schools in the province, but it wasn't a specific agenda item. As I said, the conversations have been active and ongoing in between the department and each specific Indigenous group and leader. As you can imagine, each one comes with their own set of unique circumstances, and we're trying to be respectful of that for them as well.
Absolutely. And in terms of an apology, where has the...
Yeah, no, so I've been open in saying that we're willing and able and wanting to do an apology, and was hoping to do it, except COVID-19 got in the way. And now we are moving forward to make sure that we have an opportunity that is fitting of the apology that's required. This isn't just checking a box. This is a meaningful apology on behalf of the government and the people of Newfoundland and Labrador towards our Indigenous people in the province, and we need to make sure that we're doing it right. And we are advancing that apology with each respective leader.
And as I understand it, the Innu Nation wasn't present today, but
Yep.
in terms of talking about the Great Nation Muskrat Falls deal, where is the...
Yeah, so we have a process agreement in place, and the Innu leadership and myself and the provincial government leadership have agreed amongst ourselves that we wouldn't comment on that publicly. It's an ongoing active discussion between the two parties.
Is there a timeline when you might comment on?
Well, when we come to resolution, hopefully.
And you mentioned, first steps. What are some of those steps that we need to take towards reconciliation?
Well, I think, we need to reflect on our past. We need to openly admit to ourselves and not in quiet conversations anymore that there is systems problems throughout our history and throughout our current set of institutions that we need to, as leaders, take ownership of, responsibility for, but more importantly, take responsibility to change the narrative and to change the culture within those institutions that we hold dear to Newfoundland and Labrador. Progress can be made. It has to start somewhere, and it's starting here today.
What are some of the issues, though, that were brought to you by the members?
Yeah, sure.
That you wanted here today?
So the topics were wide-ranging, of course, including mental health and addictions, systemic racism, infrastructure capacity within communities, gender-based violence. All these topics were discussed in an open and safe place so that opinions could be expressed, and we would, as leaders, digest them and try to work as best we can with our Indigenous partners to resolve them in a reflective, responsible way that sets the new path for Newfoundland and Labrador's future.
And why is it so important, this path? This is the path you want to take. Why is it so important to do it this way?
To start with our Indigenous leadership, because it's the previous path of colonialism hasn't exactly landed us in a good spot. So this is a new path of joint solutions, working together in a collaborative fashion, not employing our suggested solutions on others, listening, digesting, taking the evidence, and then creating a path that we will try our best to move forward towards together. You can only move forward together when you're having that open dialogue, and I think that's what's so important about having these weekly calls, and then to have a forum like this to go outside the scope of a weekly call to ensure that we're listening and moving in that path together. And look, there's no hidden agenda here, and there's no obviously disillusion by me or even by any of my colleagues that this is a path, and it will be windy and bumpy, and we may make mistakes along the way, but we have to start somewhere, and the old colonial way is not the way forward for this generation and the generations to come.
And with today being a day for conversation, what action might we be seeing in the next few months that might arise out of it too?
Yeah, sure. We've definitely heard themes of, if I'm going to summarize kind of some of the themes specifically around what we heard in terms of changing the culture of institutions, there was themes of education driving change, there's themes of changing symbols to reflect our Indigenous history, there was changing the structure, changing the systems, changing the governance, and frankly an overall arching theme of collaboration and how we can work together to try to achieve those goals. And that, I think, is quite evident on the weekly calls, even the Indigenous partners sharing their own experiences amongst themselves even, and there's no us versus them, it's only us on those calls, and I really felt like that was present, that was very much front and center in today's meetings, that this wasn't a us versus them. There was no competitive space. This was very much a collaborative, open session that to try to come to solutions. It was very much solution driven, and I'm hopeful that, you know, when we have the next one, we can show places where we've made good progress, and we've made good progress already, by the way, through the use of these calls. You know, for example, changing the coat of arms, changing Red Indian Lake, changing the name of Red Indian Lake, creating a Beothic statue, changing some of the symbols that exist in the foyer of the Confederation building even. All these things kind of add up as individual items. They may not appear to be much, but collective, they're part of the process of cultural change that needs to happen here in Newfoundland and Labrador.
And where does the lake name change stand right now?
It's coming to the floor of the House of Assembly in the city.
Next week.
Yes, yeah.
Chief Mitchell, what were some things that you brought to the table in terms of, you know, from a Labrador perspective, of what needs to happen in terms of those first steps and to get to that reconciliation?
Well, thank you very much. One of the issues, of course, that I presented today to the Premier and others is this conversation regarding Qalipu enrollment. We've been engaged in an enrollment process now for 12 years. It has to come to an end. We have to get our membership finalized. The province has been very supportive of things that are happening with us in terms of our relationship with the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada. Back in March, the Minister advised me that we were stopping discussion about bringing back, for example, the Federation of Newfoundland Indians and those affiliated with that band back in the day. The very people from recognition was initially started. We left some of these people behind, we left them out, some lost their status or never got in when they should have. So that was a key topic for me today. And Premier Furey understands reconciliation very well. So, in a nutshell, reconciliation is about accepting and acknowledging what happened in the past, and certainly what is going on today, but having a willingness for atonement, moving forward in the spirit of mutual respect and positive change. Mutual respect and positive change. And this is what the province is trying to do with us, working forward together in a sense of collaboration, as the Premier referred to it. Other topics that we brought up were more practical ones, housing, for example. What do we do there? We talked about the need for a transition house, for example, for the people in Bay St. George. We talked about other things, particularly the province's recent acceptance of the national holiday for Truth and Reconciliation. Our province took that holiday on at the provincial level very quickly. We talked about it at a weekly call. Within 2 days, the Premier announced we will be acknowledging National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And we have to bring others along because there are other provinces in Canada now who aren't there. So we talked about the importance of that event. We talked about the importance of the repatriation of the Beothic remains, led initially, by the way, by Chief Mazel Joe from Qalipu First Nation in Conner River. Many other topics came up and different people had different conversations. We have Chief Dave Wells here with the Mi'kmaq First Nations Assembly of Newfoundland. Enrollment was a key piece for him also. They've been involved in a number of court cases. So we're asking the province to help us. I made a direct request from the Premier to get involved with the federal government and get the minister back to the table. Now, we don't know who that minister is going to be yet because the Prime Minister hasn't announced a new cabinet yet. But we have to get back to the table, yes, in the spirit of reconciliation. Because I told the group today, avoidance is not a pathway to reconciliation. We need the Minister of Indigenous Services talking with us again about how we're going to get our enrollment process better and finalized. 12 years is too long. Too many resources have gone into this process. I'm tired, it's frustrating, but we need to get the federal government back talking with us. And what better way for me than to have our own Premier who speaks highly of reconciliation, understands the issues, as does Minister Lisa Dempster behind me. What better way to get the federal government back talking to us and have our own provincial government speaking to the Prime Minister and others